You can tell a lot about a person by how they treat someone who has nothing to offer them. Not status, not money, not power, just time, silence, and maybe a few fading memories. Most people walk away from that. But my grandmother never did. My name is Adam Cole. I'm 36 years old. And the woman who raised me wasn't perfect, but she showed up when no one else did, and kept doing it, long after it got hard. Long after she had every reason to stop. She wasn't just my grandmother. For a long time, she was my entire world. My earliest memories aren't of my parents. They're of her. I remember sitting on the kitchen counter while she stirred soup in a battered pot, humming to herself in between stories about people I'd never met. She used to say every meal needed three things: a bit of spice, a lot of salt, and someone you trusted in the room. She always made sure I was that someone. When my parents divorced, I was barely 6. My mother moved in with her new boyfriend 2 states away, and my father, well, he just stopped showing up. No goodbye, no birthday call, just silence. It was Grandma June who stepped in. No court order, no drama, just a tired woman in her 60s saying, "Well, I guess it's just you and me now, kid." And it was. She didn't coddle me, she didn't lie and say everything would be okay. She just made sure I had dinner every night, helped me with homework, and taught me how to fold laundry properly. She had this way of making ordinary moments feel important. Saturday mornings were for pancakes. Sunday afternoons were for trimming the roses. And every evening, before bed, she'd sit on the edge of my mattress and read a few pages from whatever book we were working through. Sometimes I pretended to fall asleep just to hear her voice longer. As I got older, I started to notice how tired she really was. She worked 2 jobs, one at a local bakery and another cleaning rooms at a small motel off the highway. She'd come home with flour on her jeans and aching knees, but she never once complained. Not when I got suspended for punching a kid who made fun of my clothes. Not when she had to drive 3 hours to pick me up from a weekend school trip because I forgot the return date. Not even when I told her I wanted to leave our small town for good after high school. "Go," she said. "See the world. You don't owe this place anything. Just don't forget where your roots are." I didn't. But I didn't call as often as I should have either. When I moved to Atlanta after college, everything was fast. My first real job, my first real apartment, my first serious relationship. I sent her postcards, called on holidays, sent money for her birthday when I remembered in time. She never made me feel guilty. But once, during a visit home, she handed me a grocery list written in her shaky handwriting and said, "You don't know how nice it is to have someone reach the top shelf again." It gutted me more than any lecture ever could. She never told me when she first got sick. I had to hear it from my mom, who'd moved back to town after her second divorce and had started checking in more regularly. She said Grandma had been forgetting things, that she looked pale, that she'd fallen twice in 1 week. I took time off work, drove the 6 hours back home, and when I walked through that familiar doorway, I realized how much had changed, and how much I hadn't been there to see. There were post-it notes on every surface. A hospital bed had replaced her recliner. The kitchen smelled like antiseptic instead of cinnamon. She looked smaller, thinner, but she still smiled when she saw me. "You came," she said. Of course I did. I told myself I'd stay for a few weeks, just until she was steady again, just until we figured out a long-term plan. That was 3 years ago. In that time, I bathed her, fed her, cleaned up after her on the days she couldn't get to the bathroom in time, sat beside her when she cried because she forgot my name for 5 seconds. There were nights I stared at the ceiling and wondered what the hell I was doing. There were mornings I hated the quiet so much I turned on the radio just to hear a voice that wasn't mine. And there were moments, rare, small, perfect moments, when she'd look at me, squeeze my hand and whisper, "I'm so glad you're here." Those made everything else worth it. My cousins visited twice. Once, around Christmas, when they needed photos for social media, and wanted to make sure Grandma remembered them. And again, 6 months before she died, when they learned she'd updated her will. I wasn't in the room when she met with the attorney. I didn't ask what she said, but I saw the look on Natalie's face after the visit, tight-lipped, tense, and calculating. It wasn't grief. It was strategy. After that meeting with the lawyer, the mood shifted. Natalie stopped texting. James, who barely ever showed up even for birthdays, started asking questions, veiled, polite ones at first. "Hey, what's Grandma's attorney's name again? Just checking in?" Or, "Did she mention anything about future arrangements?" You know, for peace of mind. But it was never about peace. They'd smelled money. A few weeks later, I found a copy of the updated will in a folder near Grandma's nightstand. It was labeled in her handwriting, "For when I'm gone. Don't let them guilt you." She'd left the house to me, the savings too, what little was left of her pension. Some antique jewelry that had been in our family for generations, things Natalie always assumed she'd get because she appreciated style. It hit me like a gut punch. I sat on the edge of her bed for nearly an hour, reading it again and again. She hadn't told me. She hadn't even hinted. But it was there, in black and white, signed and witnessed. I wasn't angry. I wasn't proud. I was humbled, scared even, because I knew what was coming. When she passed, quietly, one gray morning in March, it didn't feel real at first. I'd stepped out to get her favorite tea. She hadn't been eating, but she still liked the smell. When I came back, the nurse was standing in the hallway, arms folded across her chest, eyes wet. "I'm so sorry," she said. I nodded, but I didn't cry. Not then. I just walked into the room, sat beside the bed, and held her hand like I had 100 times before. It was still warm, barely. "Thank you," I whispered. I don't know if she heard. The funeral was small. She'd asked for that. No church, no pastor, just music, flowers, and a gathering of whoever felt like showing up. I gave the eulogy. I spoke softly, clearly. I didn't try to make her a saint, but I made sure people knew what she gave, and what it cost her. Natalie sobbed through most of it. People thought it was grief. I knew better. James stood in the back, eyes dry, jaw clenched. He left before the reception even started. By the end of that week, I was already getting emails from their attorney. Concern over the mental clarity of the deceased, concerns of coercion, request for mediation prior to formal contestation. It was all worded professionally, just vague enough to be threatening, just polite enough to avoid being called harassment. I took it all to Grandma's lawyer, Marvin. He chuckled, shook his head. "Same story, different day," he said. "They think because you were the one here, you must have influenced her. Classic guilt mixed with greed. They won't win. She was of sound mind." He paused. "But they'll try to wear you down anyway." And they did. I spent the next 4 months in a fog of paperwork, phone calls, and legal consultations. The house I'd grown up in started to feel like a courthouse. Boxes of discovery documents sat beside the fireplace. I couldn't sleep in my room anymore. I kept expecting to hear her call for water or shift in the bed across the hall. Instead, there was only silence, and that terrible, crushing echo of absence that doesn't feel like grief. More like a heavy blanket that never lifts. One evening, I opened the fridge to grab something for dinner and found the milk had expired 3 weeks earlier. The rest of the shelves were almost empty. A single jar of mustard, 1 egg, a limp bunch of green onions. I hadn't noticed. I'd been eating whatever, or nothing at all. I closed the fridge and sat down on the kitchen floor, back against the cabinets, and just breathed. No tears, no anger, just a quiet, dull ache behind the ribs. I missed her laugh, her voice, the way she used to hum when she cooked, the way she always knew when I was lying, even about stupid things like I already vacuumed. and I missed feeling needed. I started walking in the evenings, just a block at first, then 2, then 5. There's something about the rhythm of your own footsteps that helps quiet the noise in your head. That's how I met Carl, an old man who sat on his porch every day at the same time, sipping sweet tea and talking to a worn-out cat that didn't seem to belong to anyone. "You that June's boy?" he asked one night. "Her grandson." "She was good people," he said. "Always brought extra pies for the church raffle. Told me once my tomatoes were the saddest thing she'd ever seen. She was right." We laughed. That was the first real laugh I'd had in months. Eventually, the court date came. It was short. Natalie and James tried to argue she wasn't thinking clearly, that I'd isolated her, that I'd benefited unfairly. But Marvin was ready. So was the paperwork. So were the doctor's notes confirming her mental clarity. So was the video recording she'd made, shaky but firm in voice. "I'm giving this to Adam," she said, looking right into the lens. "Because he was here. Because he never asked for anything. Because he gave me more than I could ever give back." That was it. Case closed. No appeal. No more letters. Just silence again. But this time, it was the kind I could breathe in. The 1-year anniversary of her death came quietly. No phone calls, no visitors, just me, the morning sun, and the cold air that still clung to early spring. I didn't make a big event out of it. Grandma hated that kind of thing. "Don't light candles or cry at a stone," she once told me. "Do something useful. Go pull weeds or bake something decent." But I went to the cemetery anyway. I brought her the kind of flowers she used to grow out back, white gillyflowers and pale gloxinias. Simple, elegant, quiet, like her. The headstone was modest. Her name, her years, and a line she'd chosen herself. She showed up when it mattered. That one got me. Not because it was poetic, but because it was true. After standing there for a while, I sat on the bench nearby and just let the silence happen. I thought about that last winter, when her hands were too cold to hold a cup properly. About how I'd warmed them between mine before she drifted off. About the way she still made jokes, even in the pain. "Don't let me become one of those bitter old ladies," she'd say. "You see me starting to complain about the weather or how kids dress? Smack me." I never had to. Even near the end, she was sharper than most people half her age. I pulled out the letter she left, the one I'd kept folded in my wallet, and read it again. "Don't waste your life feeling guilty for living it." I wasn't sure I knew how to do that yet, but I was trying. Later that week, I finally tackled something I'd been avoiding. Her closet. It still smelled like her perfume, that soft lavender scent she used for decades. I had to stop twice just to catch my breath, not because I was tired, but because every fabric held a memory. Her old blue cardigan, the one she wore whenever she baked, the silk scarf she only brought out for holidays, a shoebox full of letters, postcards, and clippings. I found an old birthday card I'd made her in 2nd grade. It was crooked and covered in glue stains. It said, in shaky pencil, "To the best grandma in the whole world, I will always protect you." I wasn't sure I'd done that, but I hoped, in the end, she felt safe. I boxed most of it for donation, kept a few things: the cardigan, the scarf, the shoebox, and the tiny gold heart necklace she used to wear tucked into her blouse. She'd told me once that it was given to her by her mother, and that she'd worn it during the hardest times of her life. "I don't wear it for luck," she said. "I wear it to remind myself I've made it through worse." I strung it onto a new chain and wore it for the first time the next day. Didn't take it off for weeks. The following Sunday, I was back at the senior center dropping off some supplies for Carl when I noticed a woman planting tulips in the small garden plot behind the building. Elise. We'd exchanged pleasantries before, mostly hellos and "Is Carl behaving?" But I'd never really talked to her outside that context. She was crouched in the dirt, sleeves rolled, hair pulled back, completely focused. I almost walked past, but she looked up just then and smiled. "You always come around with something in your hands," she said. "Force of habit." She stood and brushed her palms on her jeans. "You ever plant tulips?" she asked. "Not on purpose." She laughed softly. "Well, I've got extras if you feel like trying." I stayed. We planted them together in the soft spring soil. She gave me a small trowel and a paper bag of bulbs. "Deep enough so they don't panic when the frost hits," she said. "Plants panic? If they're shallow and spoiled, sure." It was the first time I'd smiled, really smiled, in a while. We didn't talk about much. Not the past, not death, not grief, just soil and bloom time, and whether or not squirrels were secretly evil. She had a gentle way of saying things, not like she was trying to teach, more like she was remembering with you. By the time we finished, the sun was dipping low, and the sky had turned that dusky orange you only get for 10 minutes a day if you're lucky enough to catch it. I stood up, dusted off my jeans. "Thanks," I said. "For what?" "For not asking me anything heavy." She smiled again. Sometimes not asking is the kindest thing. I left, feeling lighter, not healed, but a little more like someone who could eventually heal. I didn't expect to see Elise again so soon, but the next Tuesday, she called. Well, technically, she texted. Her number popped up with a simple message. "Carl says the tulips you planted look like they're sulking. Might be your technique. Want to defend your honor over coffee?" It made me laugh. I said yes. We met at a small coffee place near the park, one of those independent shops that still had mismatched mugs and handwritten chalkboard menus. She was already there when I arrived, stirring something into her cup. When she saw me, she waved me over with a relaxed ease that made me feel like I belonged, even though I wasn't sure I did. "I ordered you something reckless," she said. "Hazelnut with 2 sugars. Thought maybe you needed to loosen up." I smiled. Is it that obvious? Only to people who've been there. We didn't talk about Grandma, or court hearings, or the quietness of an empty house. We talked about books, about her son's obsession with space and her daughter's phase of collecting rocks that are definitely just parking lot gravel. She had stories, good ones, and she told them in the same way Grandma used to, with warmth, but no need for exaggeration. When the coffee was gone, she stood and slung her bag over her shoulder. "I'm taking the kids to the park on Sunday," she said. "They could use a distraction. And I think you could too." I hesitated. "Nothing big, just bring a jacket, and maybe don't wear your funeral face." That made me laugh out loud. An actual sound, not just air through my nose. "All right," I said. "I'll come." That Sunday was warmer than expected. Her kids, Hannah, age 7, and Leo, 10, were a mix of shy and curious at first. Hannah hid behind her mom's legs. Leo asked if I'd ever been arrested. "I've only had 1 parking ticket," I said. He seemed disappointed. We tossed a frisbee. They taught me some made-up game involving sticks and yelling. At one point, I helped build a crooked little fort out of branches, and Hannah declared me the fort mayor. Later, Elise and I sat on a bench while the kids ran up and down the grass hill behind us. "They like you," she said. "I bribed them with juice boxes." "They liked you before that." She paused. "You're good with them. You're not trying too hard." I shrugged. Maybe I'm just tired. She looked at me for a moment, then nodded. "Yeah, I know that kind of tired." As the afternoon faded, Leo asked if I could come over for spaghetti night, because Mom always burns the garlic bread and we need backup. Elise looked half embarrassed, half amused. "You're not obligated," she said quickly. "I'm not running," I replied. That night, we sat around her kitchen table while the kids made ridiculous spaghetti sculptures with their forks, and Elise told me about her late husband, gently, without drama. Just facts, and how grief doesn't look like a movie. "He died 3 years ago," she said. "Car accident. He was driving home from work, tired, and drifted into oncoming traffic. It was over in seconds." I didn't say anything, just listened. She appreciated that. I washed the dishes while she put the kids to bed. The house was small but warm, nothing extravagant, just photos taped to the fridge, magnets from zoos and aquariums, and the quiet hum of a place that had rebuilt itself after breaking. When she came back into the kitchen, she leaned against the doorway and watched me rinse the last pan. "You always clean up after everyone?" she asked. "Only after people who cook without burning things." That earned a smile. She walked over, took the towel from my hand, and dried the pan without a word. The silence wasn't awkward. It felt earned. Over the next few weeks, I visited more often. Nothing intense, just evening walks, helping Leo with a science project, reading a bedtime story when Elise was too tired. We never labeled anything. There was no grand confession, no first kiss in the rain. Just steady, slow presence. The kind that matters more than anyone tells you when you're young. One night, Elise and I sat outside on her porch after the kids had gone to bed. The stars were faint, but the sky was clear. She had a blanket wrapped around her knees, and I handed her the mug of tea I'd made. We didn't speak for a while. Then she said, "You know, I used to think life had to make sense, that it had to follow some kind of logic. Work hard, be kind, and everything would unfold the way it should." She looked over at me. "But I think life is just people. Showing up. Or not." I nodded. "I showed up too late," I said softly. "For my grandma, I mean. I should have come sooner." She didn't say, "No, you were there when it counted." She didn't say, "Don't be so hard on yourself." She didn't say anything at all. She just reached over, gently squeezed my hand, and kept it there. It was enough. The tulips bloomed 2 weeks earlier than expected. Bright reds, soft purples, pale yellows, all standing in neat, hopeful rows behind the senior center. Carl said it was because the soil was finally warmed by good company, which made Elise roll her eyes and mutter something about poetry being wasted on gardeners. I brought coffee that day. Elise brought muffins her daughter helped bake, lopsided and covered in cinnamon. We didn't say it out loud, but something in the way we moved around each other, like we belonged in the same frame, told me it was okay now. Not perfect, not healed, just okay. And for the first time in a long time, okay felt like enough. At home, the garden behind my grandma's house was also coming back to life. I'd avoided it for a long time, let the weeds run wild, the roses choked by thorns. The wooden trellis she loved so much had started to rot at the base, but something changed after the tulips bloomed. One Saturday morning, I went out with gloves and pruning shears and just started. Hour after hour passed. I cut, trimmed, cleared, watered, pulled out the weeds by hand, dug my fingers into the dirt like I used to when I was 7 and thought worms were treasure. And when I was done, I stood there, covered in sweat and soil, and felt something shift in my chest. Like breath. Like space. Like her. I planted new roses along the back fence, red ones like she used to favor. Bought a wind chime she would have hated. Noisy nonsense, she once called them, and hung it near the porch just to make her laugh in whatever dimension she might still be watching from. Inside, I painted the hallway. Replaced the cracked tile in the kitchen. Not because it needed to be fancy, but because she'd always said, "Don't live like you're waiting for someone else to show up and fix things." I even put a small photo of her near the front door, just one. Her laughing, head thrown back, eyes full of light, not framed, just leaned on the shelf next to the keys. She was home, and somehow, so was I. Elise came by one evening with the kids. Leo had built a catapult out of popsicle sticks and rubber bands. Hannah brought me a hand-drawn picture of our garden. Our, meaning the one behind the senior center, but it might as well have been both. "I added you in," she said, pointing to the sketch of a stick figure with a hat. "You're the plant boss." "An honor," I said. Later, while the kids chased fireflies and giggled in the backyard, Elise and I sat on the porch swing. It creaked softly under our weight, the way it had when Grandma used to sit there and hum to herself in the evenings. "I used to think quiet meant something was wrong," I said. "Now I think it just means something is resting." She looked at me. "That's a better definition." We sat there until the sky turned from gold to deep blue. I never thought peace would look like this. I used to picture it like a finish line, something you reached after fixing all the broken pieces and winning all the arguments. I thought peace came with answers, but it doesn't. It comes when the questions stop needing to be asked, when you stop replaying the scenes in your head, when you stop needing other people to understand why you stayed, or why you hurt, or why you still talk to someone who's not there. Peace is putting your hand in the soil and not needing anyone to clap for it. Peace is reading a letter, again, and letting the tears come without needing to explain them. Peace is letting yourself be happy without guilt. On the second anniversary of her passing, I took the kids to the cemetery. Elise asked if I was sure. I said yes. We brought wildflowers and lemonade. Hannah read her a poem she wrote at school. Leo left a rock shaped like a heart. I stood back and watched them, these two little people who'd never met her, who only knew her through stories and soft mentions and the way I kept her memory alive by not letting it define every room. And then Hannah looked up at the headstone and said, "She must have been nice if you stayed for her." I swallowed hard. "She was," I said. "She still is." We went home after that, had grilled cheese and tomato soup, watched a movie, laughed, lived. And somewhere between doing the dishes and locking up the back door that night, I realized something. I didn't feel alone anymore. Not in the deep, echoing way I had for so long, the kind that wrapped around your ribs and whispered lies about how no one would understand. That was gone. Not because life had gotten easier, not because I'd gotten everything I wanted, but because I had shown up. For her, for them, for myself. She showed up when it mattered, and in the end, so did I.